So this is the second half of my video on how to build the quickest, easiest hand plane ever. If you haven't watched part 1, it's worth going back and checking it out. I discuss all the theory and design considerations of making a wooden plane, and I also show you how to make this simple, high-carbon steel plane iron for $14 or $15 and about half an hour worth of work. So if you haven't watched that video, go back and check that out. If you've already seen the video, let's move on to actually making the plane. To make your plane, you need a big chunk of hardwood. For measurements, you need your piece of wood to be about 7 inches long, because we're making something roughly smoothing plane size. It needs to be 3 to 4 inches high, depending on the size of your hands. And for the width, you need the width of your iron plus about an inch, give or take. Now, if you don't have any big chunks of wood laying around, it's no problem. Just laminate together several thinner boards until you build up the width that you need. They can even be different species. It really doesn't matter. For my plane, I'm going to use this old jointer plane. I got it for free, and I don't really need it for anything because I have a bunch of jointers. It's also so old and dried out and beat up that it's just not worth saving. But on the other hand, it's made of beech, which is the traditional plane maker's wood. It's the right dimensions, and it's as dry and stable as you could possibly ask for. No matter what you're using, the first thing you want to do is turn your piece of wood into a nice square block. For me, this is going to involve cross-cutting the plane roughly where the mouth is, and then taking really light cuts off of both the sides, the top, and the bottom, so I have a clean and square piece of wood. Once your stock is squared up and prepared, the next thing you have to do is slab off the sides so that you can create the inner parts of the plane and then laminate it back together again. What you want is for the center section to be the thickness of your blade plus a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch. That's going to allow you to laterally adjust the iron and square your cut up if the edge of your iron isn't 100% straight and even. It's a very important part of adjusting the plane. My advice is that while you're slabbing off the sides, you aim for having the center section a tiny bit bigger than it needs to be. You can always bring it down later on, but adding more wood is a real pain. Now, my stock is just about exactly 3 inches wide, and my blade, because I ground a little off of either edge, is 1 7/8 inches exactly. That means I have a little over a 1/2 inch on either side. And what I'm going to do is slab a 1/2 inch piece off of either side, but I'm going to keep the saw kerf in the slab on this side. So I'm going to end up with about 3/8 of an inch on either side, and the middle is going to be thicker than it needs to be. After I've got the sides taken care of, I'll trim down the middle to make it exactly the size that I want. Most books on plane making stress the use of the bandsaw to resaw the blank and get the cheeks. But I honestly think for any piece that's within the capacity of your table saw, it actually offers more trouble-free resawing. You don't have to worry about how sharp the blade is as much, there's no drift, the setup is very rigid, and I always get good results. Part of that is I haven't done a ton of resawing on the bandsaw, and I need to work on my technique, but I get really good results out of the table saw, even if the blade's a little bit dull. What I've done here is set it up so that the cheek is actually caught between the blade and the fence. Now there's a little danger of kickback here, so I stand out of the way while I'm making the cut, just in case. But by setting it up this way, I can make the first cut, then just flip the stock around and make the second cut, and both the cheeks are going to be exactly the same width, with no need to duplicate the setup. When I'm done, the table saw will probably leave some scorch marks and some unevenness. If you have a plane, this is a great time to just plane that stuff off. But if you don't, it's nothing to worry about. Just take a piece of sandpaper stuck down to any flat surface, like a piece of glass, and just rub it back and forth until you've got a mostly flat piece of wood. If there are still some minor imperfections, it really doesn't matter. As long as you can lay a straight edge along the cheek and you've got a mostly flat surface, it'll glue up just fine. Now it's time to lay out the cuts that are going to determine the inside of our plane. I'm going to start with one of my smoothing planes. This is a number 4 over here, and I want to have similar proportions to that. So I'm going to measure how far back the mouth is from the heel of the plane. And it's about 7 inches. So I'm going to go 7 inches in on my center stock and make a tick mark there. Then I'm going to take my favorite little tri-square that has a 45-degree angle built in and use that to lay out my 45-degree ramp. This is going to be the bed for the plane. Now, if you don't have an accurate little machinist square like this, feel free to grab a carpenter's speed square. They're really inexpensive and they're usually accurate enough for this sort of work. Just for kicks, let me line it up with the line I just made. It's perfect. This appears to be just as accurate as my expensive machinist's or engineer's square. So now I have this cut here, and this is what I'm going to do with the table saw. One of the things I really like about this style of plane making is that it's very forgiving. But one part that has to be absolutely precise is the bed of the plane. That's the 45-degree cut that we're about to make. But it needs to be perfectly straight, perfectly flat, and absolutely dead square to the rear stock of the plane. If these things aren't done right, your iron isn't going to bed properly and your plane isn't going to work at all. Now, I've got a decent table saw, and I'm going to tilt the blade, double check it with a square to make sure it's at exactly 45 degrees, and using the miter gauge that I've carefully calibrated, I'm going to make the cut. Now, if you don't have a table saw, this would be a great time to find a friend who's got one, because I think the table saw is probably the best and most accurate way to make this cut. It's the one thing that having a power tool is really helpful for. But if you don't have access to a table saw, and you don't have access to a bandsaw or a miter saw, there are a couple other ways that you can get this done. My number one choice would be to use a good miter box. There's a lot of them sitting around, and it's another thing that you might either have or be able to borrow. It looks like old technology, but a miter box actually makes excellent crisp angles and leaves a good surface. After my 45-degree angle was cut, I had to cut the other end of the plane, which is going to be the escapement for the chips. The standard angle for this is 62 degrees, but it doesn't make a huge difference because we might open it up with a bandsaw later on. I used a protractor to get the blade angled just the way I wanted it to, and then using a backup board on my miter gauge, I made the cut. I ended up having to make it a couple times to get exactly where I wanted it to be, so I've got a couple extra pieces here that I'm going to have to get rid of. Because of the height of my blank, my table saw can't get all the way through this piece of wood. For the waist side in particular, that's not going to be a big deal. I'm just going to take a fine-tooth pull saw and zip off this last little bit of waste. Now for the 45-degree angle, the actual bed of the plane, you can see that I've ended up with a little bit of a ridge right up here up on top. And I can't leave that. That's not going to be okay. I'm just going to use a hand plane and very gently kiss off these little tiny bits here. It's end grain, so you could use a block plane, but I actually find a standard bench plane with its extra weight is better for this sort of thing. If you don't have a plane, or if you're not good at planing yet, you could pare this waste off with a chisel and then just grind it back and forth on our flat piece of sandpaper, and that'll get you the same result. Now we're at the most critical part of making the entire plane. It's making sure this bed is really perfect. I've eliminated all the waste up on top, and things are mostly smooth. But now I'm going to take a good machinist square, hold it up to the light, and check all along the plane to see where there are problems. And I see that I do have some low spots here, and there's a little plane chatter here. That's going to keep the bed from being really perfect. Now, I could try to address these issues with a hand plane, and I'm okay at planing, but I'm not a master at it yet. And even though I've got some good experience with hand tools, I really find the sandpaper method works really well for this. A lot of people think that you have to have a plane to make a plane, but I think a good piece of sandpaper really eliminates that need. Rather than moving it back and forth, I'm taking single, sharp strokes, making sure to register the surface fully every time that I pull it. And I can already see I've improved that a great deal. Now I can feel my paper isn't cutting very well, so I'm going to brush it off. And I'm also going to give myself another advantage by penciling in this surface. Now I can see where I'm making progress and where I'm not. Let's take a few more strokes. You can see that most of the pencil is gone. A little bit of a low spot here, and some tiny bit of chatter there, which I'm not super concerned about, but I would like to eliminate at least this low spot in here. So let me keep going a little more. Another test that's really important, I'm sorry, it goes this way, is to put the iron on, push it really hard with your fingers, and try to rock it in any direction. Try to feel it move at all, even the tiniest little bit. If you can feel any movement of the iron against that ramp, it's nowhere near good enough. It's got to feel rock solid with finger pressure on it. So at this point, our plane is really starting to come together. You can see all the individual pieces and get a really good idea of what it's going to look like when it's fully assembled. Now, we're almost ready to do the glue up, but there are a few other cuts and marks we need to make before we get to that stage. Okay, bear with me for a second here, because I want to show you something important about the way planes were manufactured in the past. When I cut up the big jointer plane to get the stock for my new smoother, I saved this. This is the mouth section. This part right here is the 45-degree slope that the iron beds against, and then here's the escapement where the chips cut out. I took this over to the bandsaw and split it in half, and it shows you some useful things about the inside of the plane. You can also see something really interesting, which is this angle right here. You can tell that it comes up like this at about a 30-degree angle, and then it switches to that 62-degree escapement that we've already made on our laminated style plane. This angle right here is referred to as the wear, and you can tell it's almost parallel to the bed. And the reason that it exists is so as the plane is doing its work and it's getting more and more worn down, these two surfaces don't drift apart very quickly, and the mouth doesn't open very wide, so the plane wears more slowly. That's why it's called the wear angle. Now, most people who make laminated style planes don't include this detail, but I think our plane is going to last a lot longer if we do. And it's not very complicated. I'm just going to take my escapement block over to the table saw, set the blade at 30 degrees, and take off about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. The exact height really doesn't matter. It really just matters that it's there. Now that I've got my wear angle done, I want to improve the chip ejection and make this plane as easy to clean out as possible. I'm just going to take the lid off of a tin of grout. Anything you have with a big radius will get the job done. I'm matching it up to the top of the plane and the top of the wear angle. And I'm going to draw a curve there. There, that's perfect. Now I'm going to go over to the bandsaw and saw this curve out, and that's going to give me a much smoother and larger escapement for the chips while I'm planing. Now we're ready to actually glue up our plane. We just need to do some careful marking beforehand, and I've got some tricks to make that glue up go a little bit more easily too. So the first thing I want to do is get all of my pieces together and make sure they're oriented right, and then the thing I need to figure out is I got to get my blade projection just right. I need my rear section and my front section to be the correct distance apart so that I get the mouth that I'm looking for. So I let them get pretty close together and let the iron fall down as far as it wants to, and then just pick the whole thing up and have a look. And you can see that the iron is really nowhere near coming out the mouth right now. And that means my mouth is a lot smaller than it needs to be. That's going to result in a lot more cleanup work later than I want to do. I can move either of the sections out a little bit, which is going to let the iron fall a tiny bit more, get a good grip on it again, and bring it back up. Now the iron is very, very close to sticking out. It's probably about 1/8 of an inch. I would like it to be a little bit closer than that to make the final setup as quick as possible. And I finally ended up with the iron about 1/16 of an inch from sticking out. And that's probably good. It can be a little bit more. If you're concerned about your plane coming out really perfectly, go ahead and make that mouth even tighter for right now. You can fix that in a later stage, but I'm happy with where that is. I'm just going to keep my grip on the plane. You can use a clamp, but it's not necessary. I'm going to put a good square across the plane and then just make a tick mark across one side. And then I'm going to move the square a little bit, one direction or another, doesn't matter, and make a tick mark on the other side. Little tick mark, move the square a little tick mark. What I've done here is create 4 offset marks that line up with each other in a certain way. That way there's no way I can possibly put this together wrong. I can't switch the sides or flip anything around, because with the marks offset, the plane only lines up one way, and that's the correct way. Okay, so before we do the actual glue up, we're going to do just a little bit more marking to make things easier afterwards. Get rid of one of the sides of your plane and the iron. Take the remaining side and the 2 blocks and make sure your tick marks are lined up really perfectly. And then strike a line along the bed of your plane. Carry that line across the top of your plane. Go ahead and mark that line on the outside. Having that line there is going to show us where the ramp is exactly, and it's going to help us place the pin when it comes time to drill that. We're going to drill that after glue up. It's one of the advantages of making this plane the easy way. I'm just going to do a couple things to get prepared to make sure the glue up goes well. First thing I'm going to do is add marks to the inside of all the parts of the plane, so that when I take the cheeks off, I can see where my blocks are going to be and where not to put any glue. With a multi-piece glue up like this, I've got 2 things that I'm concerned with. The first is keeping everything flat and keeping all the pieces on the same plane. Now, if your workbench isn't perfectly flat, and mine isn't, it's a really good idea to introduce an auxiliary clamping surface. This is a piece of melamine. It's just a shelf that one of my neighbors was throwing away, so it was free. It's perfectly flat, and also the slick coating doesn't provide anything for glue to stick to, so I don't have to worry about gluing my plane down to my bench. Now, to make sure that everything ends up in exactly the same plane and squished down nice and tight, I'm going to put this gluing stick across the top of the plane. It's just a piece of plywood turned up on end. And that end orientation means that it's very, very rigid this way, and it's going to distribute the weight of clamps really evenly. Once I've got those set, I'm going to double check that my marks line up, and they all do, so that's great. And then I'm going to worry about my other concern, which is making sure the cheeks are really tightly pressed in to the 2 center blocks. There's also an element of common sense here. If the sides of the plane look like they're stuck into the center blocks, you're probably good. If you can see gaps anywhere, add more clamps. I'm going to add glue to all of the sides, making sure to keep glue away from the escapement where I've drawn my lines, and then I'm going to spread it around with a brush. With the glue spread around evenly, I'm just going to add a little bit of common table salt to both sides of my glue up. If you've never seen this trick before, it works amazing for situations where glue might lubricate the pieces of wood and cause them to slip around. The crystals get embedded in the sides of the glue up and keep things from moving. But wood glue is water-based, and salt dissolves in water. So after the salt has done its job, it just disappears into the glue joint, and it doesn't affect the strength of anything. Now we're all set. Everything's clamped up nice and tightly. It's secured really well down to the bench, and it's also sandwiched together really, really well. So I shouldn't have anything to worry about. I also took my own advice, as you can see, and added a few more clamps here because I wasn't satisfied the pressure was as even as it should be. I know I've got good clamping pressure because not only do I not see any significant gaps anywhere in the assembly, but I've also got good little bits of squeeze out here and there all around, and that tells me I've got just the right amount of glue, and this should be great. Now, I'm going to resist the temptation to mess with it and leave it just the way it is until tomorrow morning. This seems like a really good place to end part 2 of this video series. If you're following along with the build, you can do everything we did in this video up to getting your plane glued and then let it rest for a day or two while the glue dries. In part 3, we're going to cover shaping and fine-tuning the plane so it cuts really, really well. I've already shot most of that footage, so that video is going to be ready in just a couple of days. Before I go, I'd also like to say that this channel has been experiencing a lot of growth recently, and I've been doing YouTube for a year, and I've just recently started to make a tiny bit of money off of it. And none of that would be possible without my viewers, my subscribers, and especially my patrons. So thank you all so much for making this possible. I'll see you in a couple days.